Dean Keith Simonton, welcome to Bendiksen Airways.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Your name has stuck with me for, I would say, around, at least 20 years. When I did my bachelor's degree at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, I read your work and Anders Eriksson's work, and I read all of these so-called talent books. So your name has stuck with me.
Okay,
but before we go on, how would you introduce yourself?
I'm just Dean Keith Simonton. I'm now Professor Emeritus, Distinguished Professor Emeritus. I've been retired since 2016. So that makes me sort of without a title.
But how would you sum up your work?
Wow. I've done so much research on so many different aspects of genius and creativity, leadership, talent, giftedness. And I've analyzed those phenomena from so many different angles, from the behavior genetic angle all the way to social cultural factors, personality, cognition, lifespan development. I was actually trained as a social psychologist. I got my degree in social psychology from Harvard. And so I often take a social perspective because a lot of times we don't appreciate that it's the social cultural environment that has a major role in all sorts of aspects of value on chess playing. And so even though it's a relatively small country, you end up with, on a per capita basis, a lot of first-class chess champions. And you can see that in a lot of, Switzerland is another amazing example in another area where Switzerland, on a per capita basis, has produced so many Nobel Prize laureates, and particularly in the sciences, because of their culture, their emphasis on education and being intelligent, the emphasis on the professions and so forth. So, in general, I try to take as many different perspectives as I can on a phenomenon because I realize that genius and creativity and leadership, talent development are very, very complex phenomena. And you mentioned Eriksson at the beginning. One of the things that he and I have had lots of debates for over 20 years. Of course, we stopped now because he passed away, but I'm talking about live debates. We had a debate at a campus in California. And one of my complaints about him is he's one of these psychologists who likes to point to one factor and say, this is responsible for everything. Deliberate practice. All you have to do is practice every single day and about 4 or 5 hours a day for 10 years. And next thing you know, you have a Nobel Prize. Well, the evidence for that it's not like deliberate practice is irrelevant. There's so much other things going on. And like talents, he and I would get big debates. He insisted that talent doesn't exist. But I've argued, and there's good data to support this, and more data is accumulating, that talent does exist. There are certain people who take less time to master a given domain. And not only that, but there's certain people with the same amount of deliberate practice who vary greatly in their performance. Those are actually obvious facts. And Eriksson himself did an interesting study. He looked at champions in bee competitions, spelling bee competitions. And he himself found that deliberate practice only explained about 5% of the variance. So there's a lot of other stuff going on there besides just deliberate practice. And again, I don't want to downplay deliberate practice, because there's no doubt if you want to become, well, there was that famous saying, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. And that's valid to an extent. But there are people, and I happen to be one of them, who once had an aspiration to become a musician. And I it happened to be guitar. And I practiced really, really hard. And finally, my guitar teacher says, I just want you to know that you're really not going anywhere. I started plateauing out, you know? So you reach a law of diminishing returns. And what really kind of irked me is I had a friend who wasn't even taking guitar lessons, but when I come back from a guitar lesson, he would ask me, okay, what's your thing you're practicing this week? And I'd show him, and then he'd pick up the guitar and do it so much better than I could. So it's interesting how there are certain people who just have an ability to master a given domain much more quickly than other people do. And that also creates an interesting problem, because it means that we have to find the right domain. And a lot of times it takes us a long time before we find the right domain. Like in sports, this is an interesting thing. What they find is that what's optimal is for people to be in a lot of different sports at the beginning. Because when you're in a lot of different sports, then you find the sport where you really have your talent. And then you develop that. So you don't specialize at the beginning. So you might be in, you might be in football, you might be in baseball, you might even be in basketball. A lot of people play basketball also are receivers in football, American football. And what they're doing is they're discovering where their talents are.
How early are we talking?
Huh?
How early are we speaking here about?
That's interesting. But, a lot of times it can go as far as college before they finally have to make a decision. Sometimes they make the decision earlier, in junior levels. But I think it depends also on the sports, because some sports take longer to develop. So you have to be more mature. And the same thing is true in developing musical talent. There's some musical talents that require more maturity. Like piano, being able to not just hit the notes, but do an interpretation that is shows a sophisticated understanding of the music. Because Beethoven wasn't just putting notes down on a piece of paper. He was trying to convey, an expressive piece of music that has structure to it. You have to understand the structure and finer nuances of the piece. So I don't know. My specialty is not sports. I gave that example. My specialty is not sports, but I know there is research showing that being in more than one sport is often conducive to optimizing your talent as an athlete.
Yeah.
And that's true for a lot of other things too. And of course, what happens to a lot of people is that when they finally have to make a decision, then one of their would-be talents becomes their favorite hobby. So, for example, it's very common for people in mathematics or theoretical physics to also be musicians. And sometimes they'll even have an ambition to become a violinist, maybe, a virtuoso violinist, or maybe a chess player. It's another option. And then they finally make a decision that they're going to become a theoretical physicist. So now they have a hobby. So, Albert Einstein loved to play the violin, loved to play Mozart violin sonatas, and without the piano. And being a musician was a hobby for him. He learned that he was never going to be, he was someone who could get the notes right, and that's about it. So it's not like it's lost. You spend all that time developing a talent in some particular sport, and it's completely lost. It still may become a hobby, something you do on weekends. Of course, in a lot of sports, you're not allowed to play any other sport besides because a contract tells you we don't want any injuries. No football, just basketball.
Yeah, you said that some people master or have the ability to master something quicker than others. Is that also how you would define talent?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Being able to discover what you really do well can itself be considered a talent. There's a lot of examples where people will just say they're walking down the street and they hear a violin being played, and then just all of a sudden they go, "I want to play a violin. I just know it. That's my thing."
Yeah.
Or maybe it's some pickup game, in a city park, and they decide in that pickup game that this is the sport I want to do, and they do it. The sad thing, as you know, in sports is that there's a lot of talents that hit another obstacle, and that is the injury obstacle. And that is something, if you have a tendency for you to pull out a certain muscle. I used to play American football, and I encountered an obstacle. I have weak knees, and I was always popping them out. And it's easy to pop out your knees when someone is tackling you from the side. And I finally reached the point where I realized I would have to be in casts, for a few weeks. And I finally said, this is not working for me, Not that I had any special talent, but the point is that sometimes you have something else besides just pure talent you have to deal with. And of course, there's other things there's a psychological aspect. Sometimes you can't overcome, you end up having a tendency to choke, in competition. And what do you do about that? That happens in music too. People who choke in competition, and they say, I know I could have performed that. I could have hit that high C. I hit that high C every time I practice, but I couldn't do it during the audition.
So
I agree with you. That's part of. Go ahead.
Yeah. How would you distinguish the terms genius, gifted, etc.? How do you distinguish those?
Okay, that's a good question. First of all, because I was trained as a social psychologist, I see a big social element to both genius and giftedness. That is, they are cultural definitions. Each culture decides what are the domains that it values. And so in a sense, you can't have giftedness or genius in a given society if that domain if it really exists in that society. Let me give you an example. I've done a lot of cross-cultural studies. I've studied genius in every major civilization, Islam, West, Japan, China, India. And one of the things that stands out is that there are certain domains that are much more highly valued in some civilizations than in other civilizations. So to give one major example is calligraphy. And in the Western world, calligraphy is not considered a major domain of creativity. And part of that is the fault of the Romans, actually, because they developed a very square script for their monuments. And later on, that very square script, if you look at, the monks and all those manuscripts, those handwritten manuscripts, it's all very, very square, boring script. The positive side of that is that when Gutenberg decided he was going to make a printing press, those little square letters lent themselves to printing presses. You had these nice little, fonts. But if you look at Islamic civilization, if you look at Chinese civilization, Japanese civilization, they have major figures in their culture that are known just for beautiful calligraphy, just fancy stuff. But that's because their writing lends itself to that kind of thing. And at the same time, the obverse of that is that it took them much longer to develop printing presses with movable fonts, because of that flexibility. In fact, it's interesting, like in Islamic civilization, there's a bias against printed Qurans because of the fact that you lose that beautiful calligraphy that's associated. If you go to Islamic countries, you see along the side, in architecture, all these beautiful patterns, and those are actually quotations from the Quran. It's not just geometrical decoration. So that's one of the first things you have to recognize is that what is important to a culture defines what areas you have giftedness and what areas you have genius. Okay. Now let me just turn to genius because I just have an article coming out, a chapter, where I give what I consider to be the most comprehensive definition of genius. And that is, first of all, you have to contribute to a domain that is culturally valued. And that's very important because that means you can't have evil genius. If it's a domain that is illegal and you can get arrested and even executed for, like being a drug lord, you technically can't be a genius in that field because it's not culturally valued. Now, you can call it something else if you want, okay, a criminal mind genius or whatever. But that's the first requirement. You have to make a contribution to a field that's culturally valued. And secondly, and this is very important because we often associate genius with intelligence, it has to be a field that's considered to be intellectually demanding. So, there's some fields, like in certain sports, that are intellectually demanding. For example, being a coach is intellectually demanding, okay? But weightlifting, I don't know. You may know more about this than I do, but I don't know how intellectually demanding weightlifting is, okay? Once you get down the basic thing of getting the weight over your head, that's about it, okay?
Yep.
And I don't know how much there is in terms of strategy, and certainly since you don't have an opponent when you're doing weightlifting, you don't have to worry about the defense, what the defense is doing, and how to counter that defense and all that kind of stuff. So I think you can have genius like in coaching and sports, but you can't have genius in a lot of sports because they're not intellectually demanding. And therefore you can't really have genius. And at the same time, there's certain types of domains where the intellectual demands are just overwhelming, like philosophy, for example. I've actually done research showing in a study of geniuses in different fields that philosophers have the highest IQs. Because you have to be really, really smart. Part of it is you got Plato and Aristotle, huge history of philosophy. You got to become familiar with before you could even start thinking, making major contributions. And it's so hard to understand. A lot of modern philosophy, it's so demanding. You read a sentence and then you say, okay, what does this mean? Kind of thing. So, and of course, mathematics is very demanding. Science, most of the sciences are extremely demanding. I have to admit, that physics is more intellectually demanding than psychology is. So that's just, you have a Route 66.
Yeah, I do.
That's amazing. Can I just say one little thing? I actually hitchhike on Route 66 when it still existed. It doesn't exist anymore. But I hitchhiked from LA to Chicago. That's where it went.
When was this?
This is the 1960s. You know, when you did that kind of thing, you know. I just decided one summer I'm going to hitchhike to Chicago. And I thumbed the whole way, you know. Anyway, that's an aside. I didn't pass that up because you can't do that anymore. There's no Route 66 anymore, you know. Become a superhighway, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, get back to my major point. You have to contribute to a domain that's intellectually demanding as well as culturally valued. And then we have to get to the contribution. The contributions themselves, first of all, should be as numerous as possible. The more contributions you make, the more genius you show. So someone like Mozart, who had more than 600 compositions, and he only lived at 35 years old, you know, is more of a genius than Pachelbel, who has a canon in D that's still performed today. One work, and it's 6 minutes long. Okay? Mm-hmm. So he's considered to be a one-hit wonder. And there's a lot of one-hit wonders, and a lot of us would love to have one hit, you know?
Yeah.
But the point is that shows less genius than like a Mozart does.
Does fan base play in?
Pardon?
Does the fan base play in how big it is? For a musician, for example.
Yeah, the fan base is important. But the thing that's interesting about certain domains is that you can be a neglected genius and be rediscovered. So, you know, there's you know, a lot of examples of that. Well, let's pick an example in the sciences. Gregor Mendel's fan base was zero. he published his papers on, actually one major paper on his genetic theory, and he thought it was really important, and he sent copies to various famous biologists, and they just, at best, he get a note back saying, very nice, keep up the good work. He was not cited. You know, he was ignored for 35 years. And he was already dead for 16 before he was rediscovered. And now, of course, Mendel is considered to be one of the greatest biologists in history, and the founder of modern genetics. So the fan base is important, but sometimes you have to wait. You know, Van Gogh is another example. He had a fan base of one, his brother, you know, Theo, and that was basically it. And then after he passed away, actually his brother passed away too, and it was his brother's widow who started going around and saying, "I have my brother-in-law was a great artist. You want some of his paintings?" And then pretty soon people go, "Whoa, who was this guy?" You know? So fan base is important, but sometimes you have to wait, you know, to establish that fan base. Beethoven had this interesting episode. Towards the end of his life, he had a third period where he started becoming very, very venturesome. Most of the music that's very popular today is from his middle period, his second period, like his Fifth Symphony. But towards the end of his life, he went into his third period, and his music became very ethereal and abstract and spiritual. And so one time he was at a rehearsal and for one of his late quartets, and they just started going through it. And one, I think it was the violist or whatever, said, "You call this music?" And Beethoven looked at it, at him, and he says, "It's not for you, it's for a later age."
Yeah, exactly.
So the fan base is important. So you make contributions, and those contributions have to have three characteristics. One, they should be original. Second, they should be exemplary. That is, people look at it and they go, whoa. And they want to imitate you or see if they can do any better than you did, emulate you. You know, sometimes you found in new schools, like Michelangelo founded the Mannerist School of Art, you know. Everybody wanted to look like Michelangelo. And then the third thing is durability or duration. This gets back to the, sooner or later, you have to pass the test of time. So you have to be enduring. And there are a lot of examples. In fact, sadly, this is the most common thing. There's a lot of examples of people who were famous in their own lifetime who are not famous today. And that just happens. There was this French artist, Mansolier. My French is very bad. But he was a very, very famous artist in the 19th century. He was much more famous than Van Gogh. And he did historical works. Almost anytime you see a painting of Napoleon, it's by him. That was one of his tricks. And now no one's ever heard. I can't even pronounce his name. I mean, how sad can it be? He still exists. He has a Wikipedia page devoted to him. You can find his works in various museums throughout the world. He did both painting and sculpture. But no one knows who he is unless you happen to be a specialist in 19th century French academic painting.
Yeah.
You know, it's passé. So he didn't pass the test of time. So that is an interesting thing because that adds another cultural dimension that sometimes is overlooked. Is, I say you have to contribute to a culturally valued domain, but what is considered to be a culturally valued domain can change over time.
Yeah, exactly.
So a good example in the positive direction is when cinema first came out. It was poo-pooed as being nothing more than popular entertainment, and it actually started out as popular entertainment. You had the Nickelodeons. Edison had these Nickelodeons, and you would see a very short film. You turn the crank and see a very short film. And so it was popular entertainment. But it was actually Thomas Edison himself who realized this could be a serious art form.
Mm.
And so he made the very first feature-length film, The Great Train Robbery. Yeah. Now, by modern standards, it's not very artistic. But it was the beginning. And then it took about 30 years for Hollywood to say, dang it, we are more than just entertainment. We are an art form. And they created the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And they started offering the Oscars every year. And that was to underline that cinema is now, in fact, it's now called the seventh art. Now you have dance and music and poetry and so forth, and then you have cinema as the seventh art. So the cultural value for cinema changed from poo-pooing it, saying you can't really take it seriously, to realizing it's a major art form. Now it can work the other way as well, kind of sadly. One of the things that's interesting is sometimes people will become creative in a domain that becomes obsolete. Here's one of my favorite examples. There once was a time when the steam engine, the steam locomotive, was the miracle of modern transportation technology. We're talking about the late 18th and 19th century. And so there were all these inventors who became famous for improving the steam locomotive, making it much more efficient in terms of consumption of fuel and speeding up the velocity and all sorts of things like that. Most of those people are very obscure now. They have all these patents and things like that, but the steam locomotive is now something in the museums, and maybe transportation parks, things like that. But it's they've been replaced by the diesel locomotive or the electric locomotive, and the technology is totally different to those new locomotives. So those famous contributions are no longer famous anymore. Now, we can say that they were geniuses at the time, but their genius became obsolete. Their contributions are no longer enduring. And it's not really their fault. They had no way of anticipating that the electric locomotive or the diesel locomotive would replace the steam locomotive. Every town throughout Europe and North America had to have a train station that would refuel the steam engine, provide more water, provide more coal. And now that's all obsolete,
Changing of the times.
Yeah.
I guess what you just said.
I didn't answer your question clearly. I've told you what genius is, but I haven't told you what giftedness is.
Exactly.
And the thing that's different about giftedness is that you can kind of give a simple definition to it that relies on the genius definition. The way I would define giftedness is potential genius.
Okay.
If someone shows potential genius, that is, they could be a genius sometime. They're on the right trajectory, in terms of how quickly they're mastering the domain and early indicators of exceptional performance. And sometimes this happens pretty quickly. Already at 8 years old, Mozart was recognized as an up-and-coming musical genius. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this. There was actually a scientific article published in the Transactions of the Royal Society of London, which at that time was the #1 scientific journal in the world. It was devoted to a study of Mozart's talents, his musical talent. Because Mozart at the time was in London doing a tour. He's actually doing a series of performances. So they said, we might as well study this guy. Is this guy for real? And they actually ended up, at first they didn't believe that he was only 8 years old because his performance was, they actually did a thing where he did a piano duo with his father, Leopold. And Leopold was a professional musician and wrote textbooks on music and taught his son. But when they were doing, and this was a sight reading test, okay, but when they're doing a sight reading of a piano duo, Leopold kept on making mistakes, and Amadeus kept on giving dirty looks at his dad, like, "Dad, come on!" And they actually eventually got the birth certificate from Vienna to verify, or Salzburg, to verify that he was actually only 8 years old. So sometimes you can verify very, very early. He had giftedness. There's no doubt. He was on his way. And in this article, they say this guy's going to be a future musical genius. At that point, all of his compositions, he started composing, but they were still very imitative. But the fact is, he could still do these imitative compositions that sounded like other major composers of his day. And then later on, he was able to compose stuff that was uniquely Mozartian.
Yeah.
So giftedness is potential genius. So that means it has to be in a domain that is intellectually demanding. It has to be in a domain that's culturally valued. You obviously can't do the enduring thing yet because the person's too young, right? And they're still doing, a lot of their stuff is going to be juvenile in various ways, immature, but you still see that potential there, you know? And a lot of times, well, this is definitely true in sports, even though the person couldn't possibly compete with an adult professional athlete, they're still above the distribution for their age group, you know? So a lot of times you can see that the prognosis is really phenomenally good. And that is what giftedness is. Now,
All right.
you can obviously have examples where it doesn't pan out. There's a lot of child prodigies who grow up and they don't realize their potential. And it's sad when that happens. There's one famous example, William James Sidis, who was a mathematical and linguistic prodigy who started attending courses at Harvard University when he's 11 years old, which at that time was a record, the youngest undergraduate, first-year undergraduate in the history of Harvard University. Even in his first year, he presented a presentation on four-dimensional solid objects for the math club. There was a math club, and graduate students said that presentation was graduate student level at 11 years old. Well, he eventually lost interest in mathematics. In fact, he eventually hated mathematics and ended up not doing very well, getting a mediocre degree, and just kind of wandering around doing one thing or another. He did get 2 patents on perpetual calendars, which is not a highly cultural domain. It's a calendar where you only need one calendar and it'll last you forever.
That's true. A long duration.
So you do have that example, and it's sad when it happens, but not all child prodigies end up realizing their gifts. And of course, child prodigies are the extreme example of giftedness because they display talent already at an adult level at a relatively young age. That's basically the definition of a child prodigy.
Yeah. You mentioned Mozart's father there. How important is a significant other in becoming or getting out your full potential?
How significant is what? Other people?
A significant other, a father, a mother, a coach, a whatever.
It's extremely important. And one of the things that you see not only in geniuses, but also in giftedness is very early is family support. And often family support above the normal. It's very common, for example, for families when they realize they have a very talented child to move from where they live. Maybe they live in a rural area, and they'll move to a big city so that their kid can have a teacher or a coach so they can continue to advance. So that the family will actually do sacrifices for their child, for their development. In fact, this is something sort of the downside of the role of the family in talent development is that sometimes they do this at the sacrifice of the other kids in the family. Sigmund Freud is a good example of this. He was the eldest in the family, firstborn and male. In a Jewish family, he was like God, And so when it became apparent that he had real scholarly skills, and he was absolutely brilliant. He had a photographic memory, so it was very easy for him to ace tests. He had the book right in front of him. And he had a younger sister who showed some musical talents. So, and by the way, he was the only one who was allowed to have a regular lamp in his bedroom. And he had his own bedroom and a regular lamp, and everybody else had to use candles because his family was relatively poor, a wool merchant. So he could study. And then he had a younger sister who showed musical talent. So they got her a piano. And Zygmunt says, the piano interferes with my studying. So they got rid of the piano. And so, I mean, who knows? He could have had a younger sister who was a musical prodigy, but she never got the chance. So families will often invest in, and it often is the firstborn, and it often is the firstborn male, unfortunately, although that can change. And so you do have that kind of family support. And that gets back to the cultural value thing. It's easier for the family to support when the culture values what you're doing. Being a piano virtuoso or a violin virtuoso is something that is cool. It's important. There's recitals you can do, and there's all these opportunities you have in your culture, and so the family is reinforced for reinforcing their young talent. So, and of course, there's a lot of times there's competitions and so forth where you can get scholarships to support the talent development. So the importance of others is extremely important. And another example we can't overlook, I kind of hinted at this at the beginning, is the role of mentors, coaches, teachers. I mean, it depends on what it is, but having someone taking you on who can then teach you the more advanced features and force you to, practice. When you reach some plateau in your development and you start thinking about giving up, maybe that they'll give you some more exercises to do. Do this, do that. And don't worry, you'll get over this hump. Everybody has this problem, these obstacles. It takes a while to get over. And, so those mentors are, what we call them depends on what the giftedness area is or the talent area is, whether they're mentors or coaches or whatever, are also extremely important. And it's very rare where you can do it by yourself. There are a few areas where you can do it yourself. One example is kind of interesting because the major area, almost every major civilization values this area, but it's mostly for loners, and that is poetry. Most poets are self-taught. They teach themselves by loving to read poetry. They may have friends who are poets eventually, and they may feed off of each other. They may, read each other's work and maybe give some feedback on, what's good and what's not. Like T.S. Eliot, the English poet, when he had his first draft of The Wasteland, which is considered to be one of the great poems of modern 21st century English, Ezra Pound was asked to go over, and Ezra Pound, of course, was a distinguished poet in his own right, and Ezra Pound just started putting cross out this and cross out that and cross out that and do this over again and what have you. So in a way, Ezra Pound was kind of a mentor, but not in the same way that, other talent development, because he was a peer, same age peer. And also T.S. Eliot's wife also gave feedback as someone who liked poetry. But that's one of the few areas where people tend to be self-taught and do it alone, and it's unique because of the nature of poetry, I think, because it's such a personal expression. So it's kind of hard to generalize. I
think I've read somewhere that the suicide rate among poets is really high.
Oh yeah, it is really high. And by the way, it's not just in the West. I recently saw a study showing that poets in Chinese civilization also have high suicide rates, and even if they don't commit suicide, they will have suicidal tendencies like severe depression, things like that.
Yeah.
And part of that, I think, the suicide rates for poets gets back to one of the problems with being a poet, and that is very often poets aren't fully appreciated in their own time. They often have to die first. And so suicide kind of speeds up that process.
Yeah, sure
of
does.
Dying first.
Do you think it also could be because they're
depression.
do you think it also could be because they're stuck in their own thoughts a lot? That could be maddening.
Yeah. In fact, it's interesting. There was a study done by a colleague of mine. Very interesting. There's different kinds of poetry, and just let me back up a little bit. There's a form of psychotherapy, which is the writing therapy, where in order to deal with traumatic, you've had some traumatic experience, maybe you fought in war, maybe you had to deal with sexual abuse when you're a child, whatever it happens to be. And so there's this writing therapy where you write through everything and talk about your trauma, and then try to resolve it. Try to reach an end point where you realize, okay, you're past that now, all right, and you're now are able to deal with it. It's behind you. Okay, some poetry is like that, right? But some poetry, it's called confessional poetry or whatever. They dwell on it. They dwell on the pain. They dwell on the suffering. And so a lot of poets who write that kind of poetry end up committing suicide. Like Sylvia Plath, for example. She would write about all the pain that her dad caused her when she was younger. She has a poem called Daddy. And when you look at the poetry, she's not dealing with it. She's not trying to grow beyond it. She's just reliving it over and over and over again until finally she couldn't deal with it anymore. And she committed suicide. So sometimes poetry, that's something unique about poetry, is it's too easy to do that. It's too easy to get involved in a pity party where you're just dwelling on your suffering instead of trying to go beyond it. And that's where being a novelist is better, because when you're a novelist, you start with the introduction, and then you have this climax, and then you have a resolution phase, where everything gets tied together, all the loose ends get tied together. And poetry doesn't have to do that. A lot of poems don't end. They don't actually have an end. The poet is still in pain.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what you said.
What about luck? What's the role of luck?
Oh, luck is extremely important, and it, unfortunately, I think it's too important. But what's nice about it is that it's so important, but it's also behind the scenes most of the time. So it happens, but let me put it this way. We actually don't have biographical dictionaries or histories about all the great geniuses who are totally unlucky. There are a lot of people, like Van Gogh, for example. Van Gogh was tremendously lucky that he had a brother who was interested in the arts, was an art dealer, and was, like I said, he wasn't able to do it at the time. It happened posthumously. His widow was able to take over. That was very, very fortunate. If the widow died before Theo died, then Vincent would be out of luck.
Yeah.
So, luck plays a major role. And to me, one of the most sad examples of that is in sports. Use an example in sports. They just had the NFL football just had their draft thing where they draft.
Yeah.
And the sad thing about that is there's some people who are extremely talented. They may be Heisman Trophy winners, and they are drafted into the worst team. They're drafted into the Cleveland Browns, and that's going to be a career killer.
Yeah. And
unless they can figure out a way to, free agency of getting out of it, they're never going to be. A really good example of that, there was one star running back, Sanders, who was drafted by the Detroit Lions. And he was breaking all these records as a runner because the Lions didn't have really a decent quarterback. They didn't have any decent receivers. All they could do was run the ball. And they had a great offensive line for running the ball. So, and the offensive line said they'd love to block for Sanders because he was able to see the holes and all that. But they never went into the playoffs. They seldom had winning seasons. He broke these records, but the team was losing. And he finally retired early. He actually had a major record coming up. And he says, I can't play anymore. I can't play anymore for these guys. And they said, but you got this record coming up. He says, I don't care. I can't play anymore. And he quit.
Yeah.
So that was really bad luck. He just got stuck on the wrong team. And that happens a lot in team sports where you just, sometimes you finally are drafted, you're at free agency, you're finally playing for the right team, but you're past your prime.
Yeah.
Your best years are behind you. And it's kind of sad when you see that, and you say, what would have happened had that person played for that team when he was in his prime or she was in her prime? But that's luck,
Yeah. What about creativity? What is it?
Boy, creativity is something that, unfortunately, maybe because it's a relatively recent field of research, the historians of the field often say that it was founded in 1950 when a person was delivering their presidential address in front of the American Psychological Association, a guy named Paul Guilford. And Guilford essentially defined the field of creativity. There was creativity research before that, but it started being marked as, this is a field that we need to do more research on. Maybe because of that, creativity researchers have not agreed on what creativity is. And it's one of my major frustrations because I have tried to define creativity for the past dozen years using a definition I think is optimal. And I've had a hard time getting it accepted. I hope maybe posthumously it will be accepted. But right now, the dominant definition of creativity is producing an idea that has to be original and has to be useful. I think that's not sufficient. I would also say that it would have to be surprising in some way. And that's actually close to what the Patent Office says, that it should be non-obvious. And why do I add that? Sometimes you can come up with an original idea, but it's easy to assimilate to what we already know. Someone's like, oh, that may be an original idea, but that fits so-and-so's theory. So it's really not that surprising. But if the idea is original and you look at it and you say, whoa, we have no theory can possibly explain that. Or that no one has ever been able to use that technique before to do portraiture or landscaping or whatever it happens to be. And so to me, the surprising has to be a part of it. And then in another part, besides original, useful, and surprising, is that we have to make a distinction between the personal level creativity and then the social level creativity. This is where I'm a social psychologist in background. Because a lot of times, yes, we know that we're creative, but it takes a while for our society to catch up. And so like Albert Einstein, he came up with these brilliant ideas, and they eventually won him a Nobel Prize, but it took 16 years for him to get the Nobel Prize because he was ahead of his time. It contradicted classical physics, and therefore the Nobel Prize committee says we can't give it to Einstein because it contradicts classical physics. It didn't fit anything. But then they started doing more and more research to test it, and then it started fitting things, and it started becoming its own explanation. In fact, what's interesting, when Albert Einstein got his divorce, he was so confident that he was going to eventually get the Nobel Prize that in the divorce agreement, he told his wife, you get the money and I'll get the medal. And eventually he adhered to that agreement. She got the money and he got the medal. So, but it took a while for it to be socially certified. So that's why you have to kind of separate between the two. It gets back to that I mentioned earlier, being enduring. Sometimes you are a late bloomer. So your genius is not, even your creativity is not recognized, even in your own lifetime. Like Mendel, the example I gave earlier.
Yeah.
So that's the definition I prefer, but there's all sorts of definitions out there. Some people, let me just show you how extreme it gets. There's some researchers who say creativity is only in the head. It's a brain circumstance, okay? And therefore it can be studied using all the techniques of cognitive neuroscience, like fMRI, okay? And then there's other researchers that say the opposite. They say creativity is not even in the head. It's not even in the brain. Creativity is a social process, a social construction process that defines what's creative and what's not. And until that happens, you're not creative. Until your field says, that's a creative idea, then that idea is not creative. That's just totally the opposite of the cognitive neuroscientists. And there's other definitions too. We don't have to go into it, but the point is that creativity researchers are way too creative in coming up with creativity definitions.
Yeah. You mentioned, or we spoke about deliberate practice early on. How would you, what are the top factors that contribute the most to top performers, do you think, of reaching your full potential?
Well, deliberate practice is important. But can I just say one thing about that? The research, there's a lot of research meta-analyses on this. And they find that the role of deliberate practice varies across fields. It's more important for some fields. Like it's very important in musical performance, deliberate practice. So the amount of variance explained by deliberate practice, but there's no field where deliberate practice has zero influence. It always has at least 5%, something like that. Okay. Another factor is, I think, having an intense interest in your field. There are a lot of people who have a talent. They have no problems practicing, but they themselves say, I can't do this anymore. This is boring. It's like the basketball players who, they're very, very good, except they hate throwing free throws. Because the only way you can get good at throwing free throws is to throw one free throw after another. In fact, a lot of really good free throwers, they have a deliberate way of doing it. So they do it at different stages of how tired they may be. So they throw some at the beginning of practice, some in the middle of practice, and some towards the end of practice. Because, fatigue plays a major role on how you make adjustments when you throw a free throw. And but some people, they just can't do it. That's why you have some star athletes, like Shaq O'Neal was a famous example of who was notorious for not being able to throw a free throw. And he would often, they actually had a term for it, sack-a-shack or something, where you would deliberately foul him, knowing that he wasn't going to be able to, and you would have certain players that would deliberately foul him that were expendable. They could go ahead and get six personal fouls and be put back on the bench. So having that intrinsic interest in the field is very important. I already mentioned this earlier. There's certain sometimes you face, and it's not just in sports, you face physical limitations that you can't overcome. And even in music, there's an interesting example in music where there was this great composer, Robert Schumann, who also aspired to become a piano virtuoso. But he was having problems doing a certain kind of fingering. So he developed a special device for one of his fingers. I think it was on his left hand. I'm not sure, to help him strengthen that finger. Well, what happened was he ruined that finger. So he was never able to perform again. Fortunately, he married a piano virtuoso, Clarence Schumann, so she performed all of his works for him, but he couldn't play them himself. Okay? So sometimes you have a liability like that. It may be blindness. It may be deafness. Sometimes you can overcome. I mean, Beethoven overcame his deafness amazingly because he could hear the music in his head, but not everybody can. You can't overcome deafness if you are a violin player or pianist. Beethoven was a piano virtuoso, but he couldn't hear himself play anymore. And towards the end of his life, when people would visit him, they saw him playing the piano, and he didn't realize that some of the strings were broken, some of the keys were broken. And it sounded terrible.
Yeah.
So, there's certain other contingencies. That's sort of that luck factor in there where, you can't predict whether or not you're going to go deaf or go blind. And, there's a lot of other kinds of ailments. Lou Gehrig was famous for a disease that was named after him, where, Lou Gehrig disease, you just can't help it. All of a sudden you realize you're losing your coordination. You can't hit the baseball anymore. And it's over. Your talent basically reverses. So, that's also extremely important as well. And that's, one of those uncontrollables. But I think the tense interest is extremely important. Now, one thing, I just have to add one thing, and that is that it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. I've already said that the importance of deliberate practice varies, but there's other things too that vary. In creative areas, there's a personality trait that's extremely important, and it's called openness to experience. And that is a very strong predictor of creativity in almost all creative domains, particularly the arts, but also in the sciences. And that's somewhat less important in some other domains, where you can more focus on, one particular thing. So we don't expect a lot of athletes to have very broad interests and have, they like to read, foreign literature and that kind of thing. Although some do, you obviously are an athlete that have very broad interests, right? So, so I'm judging from the books behind you, So, but that is extremely important in creative domains. And we think we know why. People who have high openness experience, they tend to have defocused attention. And so they're more likely to notice things that other people don't notice. And when you notice things that other people don't notice, that leads to more likely serendipitous moments where you think, wait a minute, what happened here? And then all of a sudden you drop everything that you were doing before and you follow it up. And then you find out you've made a major discovery. Like discovery of penicillin by Fleming. He didn't do an experiment to try to discover penicillin. That was an accident. In fact, he went on vacation and left some petri dishes out in the open. And while he was away, his streptococcus culture got contaminated with penicillin mold. Okay. So it was a total accident. And instead of throwing away the petri dishes or putting them in the autoclave, he goes, well, I got to follow this up and see what's going on here. And next thing you know, we have a major medical breakthrough. Okay. Now you can see that openness, openness to various things in your environment, defocused attention, would not be useful in most sports. I gave an example of, free throws. It's famous in professional basketball for the home team to have all these people trying to distract the person while he's trying to throw a free throw. Mm-hmm. And they'll be waving all this stuff and yelling all this kind of stuff. And that works if you're distractible. But of course, if you're a great athlete, you notice you can tune everything out. And so that doesn't bother you. But there's other athletes that it does bother them, And the same thing with choking thing, you don't, what you really need to do as an athlete is a lot of time, you don't pay attention to the score. You don't pay attention to anything, but what is the best thing you can do at this particular instant, the best play you can make, and not worry about anything else. Okay. So that's an example where that's a personality trait that's very useful in creativity, but is often not very useful in other things like in sports. So there are some things where there's variation. So, and that's why you can't get a complete list of a one size fits all what you need to do. Here's a checkoff list of what you have to do.
Yeah. And I know we're running short on time. Just one final question. How do you see experience compared to or versus competence?
Experience versus competence.
Yeah.
Well, experience.
Yeah. Go.
Well, experience should become competence, right?
Yeah.
The more experience you acquire, the more competence you have. And in fact, this is the interesting thing that this is why there's no shortcuts to success. It's not just the practice, it's the experience of, and like chess. Chess is a good example where one of the major predictors of success in chess is just how many chess games you've played. And even how many chess games you lost is a good predictor of how many chess games you've won. Now, there are some chess players has never lost a game, I don't think, but that's kind of an exceptional situation. But he's certainly played a lot of games, so he's got lots of experience. Because the thing is, in a lot of areas like chess, sports, the number of contingencies is huge. The number of things that can happen are immense, and you will never encounter every possible contingency. And so all you can do is play. I find it amazing in American baseball that there are people who are doing things that have never been done before. A couple days ago, there was a guy who had 2 home runs in the 9th inning that caused his team to win. It turns out they've been doing baseball statistics since what? The 1880s. And he's the first person to have 2 home runs in the 9th inning. I mean, you'd think surely that would have happened before, but no, it's never happened. So that experience becomes competence because you're familiar with all these kinds of, and that's why, in a lot of team sports, they always have a few veteran athletes, and sure, they're past their prime, and maybe they just come off the bench at certain times. But even when they're on their bench, they're having conversations with other players, and saying, I've seen this before. This is what we need to do. Or they talk to the coach. And so the reason why you have those veteran players in is to bring that experience in and increase the competence of your co-athletes, your co-players, teammates.
Final question. What's the meaning of life?
Actually, it's sort of related, I think, in a generic way. Just like we talked about in the beginning, one of the things that you have to do is discover your talent. Discover what your gifts are. And I think the same thing is true for life. In fact, it's very interesting. A lot of people don't know this. The word genius goes back to antiquity. It actually goes back to ancient Rome. And in ancient Roman mythology, everybody was born with a genius. It was like your guardian angel. It was someone who looked after you. And it was something that made something special about you, what was unique about you. So you could have a genius for cooking or a genius for carpentry. Well, I think everybody has sort of a genius of some kind. Everybody is born with some special talent, some special interest, some special hobby that can make life a lot more enjoyable. And it's not necessarily something they're going to make a career out of it. But they love doing pickup basketball, and they enjoy doing it. We have an ex-president, Obama, and he just loves playing basketball. He's an amateur and will always be an amateur, but it's something that he enjoys doing. So discovering those things that make life enjoyable, those hobbies, and sometimes they can turn into genius. There was a famous case of this woman in the United States who was doing embroidery. That's what she did for her hobby, and she loved doing it. And it's like that, and she didn't get paid for it or anything. And then she has arthritis, can't do embroidery anymore. So her sister says, "Well, why don't you do painting?" So at 78 years old, she starts doing painting, and she was still painting at 101. And her paintings are now hanging in the White House. And there's a postage stamp with one of her paintings on. Her name is Grandma Moses. You can look her up on the Wikipedia. Now, that's a case where it was doing embroidery that made her life meaningful. And then it became genius. So that's, I think, a secret to happiness is finding those things that make your life enjoyable.
Ian, I enjoyed this. Thank you.
Besides drinking alcohol.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, Alexander. It was really good.
Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendiksen Airways.
Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.